Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator. I hope you've got over your Jubilee celebration.
Oh, the platinum, I think it is, sir. Platinum celebration of the Queen.
Well, yeah.
Well, we have. It was a good few days off to see so much happening and to see the love from people expressed towards Her Majesty, sir. I wouldn't quite say we've gotten over it because it's raised quite a lot of conversations around a topic that we've talked about in the past, sir, the Commonwealth, the place of the Commonwealth, and where we see that going after Her Majesty passes on, given her age and the frailty she's been exhibiting in the last year or year and a half. So quite a lot of talk going on, sir, regarding Her Majesty, how she stood. But what do you think, sir? I didn't plan to ask you about this one, but since you talked about it, I will ask you, sir.
Well, first of all, let's give it to the British. Nobody, I've not known any country in the world that protocol-wise can put on a grand reception with everything in place, nothing amiss. Give it to the British. I doff my hat to them. You are quite right that monitoring the 3-day events, you could see what I will call a divided nation and a divided Commonwealth, generational. Because even the issue was raised whether there will be a monarchy, not after Her Majesty, but perhaps after Charles. And the younger people, the younger British people, were rather indifferent. It was the older ones who were raising toasts and cheers, to the monarchy. Even Paddington Bear did raise a toast to Her Majesty. In terms of the Commonwealth, also, I noticed a generational division. Older members, and that included, by the way, old ambassadors, not from the Commonwealth, but from other African countries who had been posted to Britain and had retired and were living there, were all full of cheers to Her Majesty and to the Commonwealth. But the younger people raised what I suppose you will call embarrassing questions. I remember this young lady from Kenya who was a panelist, and she said, "What's all this Commonwealth you are talking about?" At the time Her Majesty became the Queen, the British had a concentration camp in Kenya. And she never said anything about that. And that concentration camp lasted for about 7 years into her reign. So the younger generation tended to be really indifferent, raising issues about reparation, raising issues about restitution, raising issues about the colonial period, while the older people were tended to be colony-minded or Commonwealth-minded, if you want to put it that way. I believe that after Her Majesty passes on, the Commonwealth as an institution is simply going to become irrelevant. It may remain as a, maybe there as a relic of an organization that once was binding several people from several continents together. But countries have moved on. When Britain left, left Europe after Brexit, she thought there would be a Commonwealth that she could just walk into, start signing trade agreements, defense agreements, and what have you, only to find out that most of the important members of the Commonwealth had also moved on to enter into trade and partnerships with other countries that were not within the Commonwealth, and they were not going to pull out of this relationship. And you'll recall that, is it Jamaica? Anyway, one of the West Indian countries actually this year removed Her Majesty as their head of state and appointed one of their own eminent citizens to replace her. It was not directed at the Queen personally, but people simply felt that, well, after 50, 40 years of independence, to still continue to have Her Majesty as the head of the nation is a relic of colonialism they needed to move away with. And when William and Kate went on a trip to the West Indies, they were booed in some of the West Indian countries, asking them to admit their role in slavery. And he did make a good speech. Not an apology as such, but admitting that Britain was involved and so on. This would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. So, of course, if it had been Harry and Meghan, I doubt whether there would have been that booing. And if it had been Charles and Diana, I doubt whether there would have been that booing. But so I think the Commonwealth is on its way out.
Well, sir, since you opened this door, let me ask you another question. Monarchy, the whole concept of monarchy, when you think about Africa and maybe some of the countries that we come from originally, and you look at the role of some of the old monarchs that we have across Africa, across even Europe, they all seem to be going the same fashion as what you've described, sir. Do you see any role in the future for monarchy as we have it today?
It depends on the role that you'll be ascribing to each monarch within which system. In most of the African countries, the monarch is still highly revered amongst the older generation. You know, I mean, face it, it's a sociological phenomenon. 85% of people from a locality will never move out of that locality. And so the monarchy, the chief, the king will be their own constant figure in their life, rather than the president, whom they may never even get to see, or the premier or the prime minister, whom they may never get to see. So if you are now talking about the role of that monarch in that locality in resolving disputes, in holding, you know, the town, the village together, that monarch will still continue to be relevant. However, the mischief which younger people have done to that institution is exactly the mischief which the colonial authorities did, the carving up of Africa. They continue to carve up towns. They continue to carve up localities, so that where you've had one monarch with recognized chiefs under him, millionaires from one minor locality will then go to the center, pay off the central government or the regional government to now promote their own subunit into, all of a sudden, you know, a big monarchical institution. So that somebody who's just a village head and had been a village head had evolved that way over centuries, becomes a crowned head at par, probably with the established monarchy that was there. Now, of course, yes, he then wears a beaded crown. He may even be richer than the established monarch, but to the people, I don't think the people ever transfer their affection from the central, you know, have you ever met the Queen?
No, sir.
All right. I've met her 5 times. And believe me, each time I still trembled. Before I stood in front of her, I still trembled. And the last time I met her, I believe I made a fool of myself. Because you are not supposed to talk to the Queen unless she talks to you. And so it was after church service. We'd gone for a conference in London, and we were, you know, bussed to attend the same church service. I think it was at Sandringham. And the tradition was that after the service, those of you who are eminent and from the Commonwealth would then wait outside the church, and she will come around shake hands and move on. But she would usually enter into small talk. So she got to me, and I'm not sure she heard what the protocol officer was whispering in. And what are you doing? And I said, I'm writing my memoirs, which was the truth. And she said, your memoirs? And she walked on. And I thought, wait, you should actually tell her who you were. Then she wouldn't have laughed, because the laughter was, here's this young man standing in front of her. She probably thought I was in my 40s, whereas actually I think I was in my 50s at that time. What has he done that, he's writing his memoirs? It was that kind of, and since I couldn't follow her, I said, Madam, excuse me, it's not what you think. Till today, I still wish I have an opportunity, to meet her. But the point I'm trying to make is, even though I'm not British, I still felt a sense of awe. And she's somebody I'd met a few times, 5 times is a few in her life. I still wasn't at ease. She was at ease because you're just going through the protocol thing. I wasn't at ease. So in a way, the monarchy still has an influence, not control, an influence. And that is really what in Africa will make me, if I meet the Asante Hene, the king of the Ashantis, I will bow in respect for that golden throne on which he's sitting. If I meet, I've met the king of the Zulus. I've met him when he was on a trip to Nigeria. And when I think of king of the Zulus, ThruMYeyes, the ancient kings, I still stood in awe in front of this modern king, but who was still the king of the Zulus. I met Princess Elizabeth of Baganda. She was a modern princess, Oxford educated, a lawyer, and so on, but I still showed respect because the Bagandas too was one of the best in Africa. Never mind what the British did in carving up, all those kingdoms. So there we are. I think the monarchy will always be there, but they will not be controlling institutions.
Well, let's bring those two things together, sir, and let's talk about the visit of the Belgian king to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and where, again, he was almost apologizing for the atrocities of his nation in that country. Number one, sir, what is your view about that? Number two, is it enough to just apologize and expect that the apology would erase the memory of those atrocities? What's your take on it, sir?
How did you ever get onto this monarchical? You didn't warn me. You were going to drag me into a discussion of monarchies and royal visits and so on.
You opened the door, sir, when you asked about platinum.
I opened the window. I didn't open the door. And that is the classical way to make a distinction. See, admitting wrong is different from apologizing, because apologizing actually has legal implications in terms of, if you admit a wrong, then the question of restitution comes in. If you apologize for a wrong, the question of the issue of restitution comes in. If you just admit that there was a wrong done, then the consequences are different financially. The king did not apologize. There was an admission of wrongdoing by his ancestors and by his country. That was not enough. Since Germany paid reparation to Namibia for the evil done there during the colonial period, European governments have been quite careful not to get dragged into following the footsteps of Germany. So, first of all, Belgium is divided, even on this issue. There were those who felt the king should not have gone. And there are those who felt he shouldn't have gone, are also those who are insisting we did nothing wrong. Our ancestors did nothing wrong. That was what was happening during that colonial period. Don't go there and start apologizing. And the government itself made it very, very clear to the king that they were not ready to be dragged into restitution, reparations. Therefore, let's keep the admission verbal. So, to that extent, to me, it was not enough. It's still panel beating the wrongs that was done. Number two, I'm not really sure here whether he brought with him or the government has promised that they will return the tooth of Patrice Lumumba. It showed you the crudity, the cruelty, the barbarism of the Belgians in the 60s that haven't killed the man, haven't poured acid on the body. One of their officials still extracted a tooth from Patrice Lumumba's mouth and took it back with him to Brussels as a souvenir. Now, and if they could do that in the 60s, can you imagine what they did in the 50s, in the 40s, in the 30s, in the 1800s? That's Belgium for you. But they're probably not the only one. I remember watching a documentary where the head of the Belgian Secret Service in the Congo, DRC, at that time, they raised the question within that there's a rumor going on in Congo that actually Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba, was back, had resurrected. You know, he just laughed, held up a cup, and said, if Lumumba has resurrected in the Congo, he has resurrected without his tomb, because this is his tomb. in this glass jar, which I brought back with me. And yet, this man's wife and children were still alive. And you are talking about what the degradation you visited on their father. So, I just regard, I mean, I'm not downplaying perhaps the, I'm not downplaying the effect emotionally of the king visiting and admitting wrong. Emotionally, it's a step forward, but believe me, it's a step in 1,000 steps. They're still not there. Who is still controlling Belgium? I mean, sorry, Congo DRC economically today? Who is still exploiting Congo DRC? The Congo is one of the richest nations in the world in terms of possession of mineral resources. And yet it is the poorest in terms of health, education facilities, infrastructure. It's one of the poorest in Africa, but it's one of the richest in the world in terms of possession of minerals. But those minerals are not under the control of the government of DRC Congo.
Thank you for that insight, sir. Let me go to Mali, sir, and ECOWAS. Just recently, the military government, I should say, in Mali announced a transition period of 24 months. Now, they've been in government, I think it was August 2020. They've been in this interim government state. And ECOWAS has responded to that to say they're not happy with it. They called for, maybe 16 months would have been okay. What is your take, sir, on the response from ECOWAS to the situation?
ECOWAS is caught up in a conflicting syndrome over Mali, and not just Mali alone, other West African countries where there are military regimes. Just 2 days ago, I was at a luncheon where the president of Ghana, who is the chairman of ECOWAS now, addressed us at that luncheon at the Metropolitan Club. And you could see in his speech, he made it clear that there should be no room for military rule in West Africa and in Africa as a whole. But that equally, there should be no room for civilian governments to fiddle around with the Constitution so that they can avoid term limitation. That there should be no room in Africa for governments to even refuse to accept term limitations in their constitutions. And that it was incumbent on institutions of governance to make sure that when civilian governments violate their own constitution, African heads of states speak out loudly the way they speak out when the military overthrows those regimes. And And it occurred to me that there's been no African country with a democratically elected government that has obeyed the constraints of the Constitution that had been overthrown by the military. Not in Ghana, not in Nigeria, not in Benin Republic, not in Kenya. Kenya is not in West Africa, I know, but I'm just expanding my submission. No, not in not in Kenya, not in Zambia, not in Namibia, and not in South Africa. Where troubles are is where civilian governments, democratically elected, have then tried to turn themselves into presidents for life. So the answer then to your question is that, yes, ECOWAS will seek to address the conundrum in Mali and in Burkina Faso as best as they could. Another point made by the president of Ghana was that it is the people, the ordinary people, who are suffering the effect of sanctions, not the government of the day. And that, so to that extent, if you say you, ECOWAS, you are acting in the interest of the people, should you really drag out this issue of sanctions? So I will not be surprised if sanctions are not removed. They are left where they are, and the military regime also gets its way in terms of the years it is allocating to itself, provided the elephant in the room, that external European power, does not step in to create problems rather than providing solution to the problems.
Thank you, sir. While we're still talking about some of these points as it relates to Africa, there is a question I want to get your views on, sir. And this one takes us to South Africa, and it's the fiasco between the South African government and a commercial airline, where the airline had said anyone holding a South African passport and traveling to the United Kingdom will need to take a test of proficiency in Afrikaans. And the South African government is kicking back. What are your views on that situation, sir?
You see, when people like me talk about institutionalized racism, people look askance as if, in what year are you living, Prof? In what centuries are you living, Prof? Racism, colonialism, there are things in the past. But are they? When the head of an international airline insists on the use of Afrikaans, does he know the role which hatred of Afrikaans as a language played in the anti-apartheid struggle? Does he know, has he ever been told, has he ever been educated that one of the things that led to the Soweto riots were hundreds of Africans. No, don't let, don't let me confuse our listeners. Thousands of Black students were killed was because they were demonstrating against the use of Africans or Afrikaans rather than English as a language of instruction. They saw the regulation as meant to eradicate the culture of Blacks in South Africa. And the students, 13-year-old, 12-year-old, 15-year-old, came out demonstrating, and they were mowed down by armed police in South Africa. In fact, it was after that Soweto uprising that led to the exodus of a lot of young South Africans who now came to study and were put in schools on scholarship by several African governments. To now be as so insensitive as to now insist that Africans will not be, you will test for the proficiency in Africans in order to be a passenger on their airline. But, I don't even know why I'm getting too hot under the collar over it, because when I was a minister, we faced a similar, not the same, a similar issue, provocation from British immigration officials who insisted that the crew of Nigerian Airways on every flight must apply for entry visa for every flight. So we said, that's all right. The crew of British Airways coming to Nigeria for every flight must go to the Nigerian High Commission in London and apply for visa for every flight. Well, that was the last we heard of that regulation. So if I were the South African regime, I would just tell the crew of this or the owner of this airline that all non-South African passengers, including your crew, flying into South Africa, must collect a visa and show their proficiency in speaking Zulu or Xhosa. Finish. And we will say who will back down, who will blink first. But, it's the insensitivity of it all.
Yes, sir. That's an interesting one, sir. Let me go to Algeria. Let's move up north a little bit and go to Algeria this time around. Algeria has said that they are suspending what they call the Treaty of Friendship and the cooperation they had with Spain. And that is causing an issue, sir. What is your view on, number one, such a treaty between Algeria and Spain? And at this point in time, where they are deciding now they want to suspend it, how significant is it going to be in the relationship between not just the two countries, but also the region in that North African axis?
Well, I mean, I have no views either way about the Treaty of Friendship if Algeria wants to sign treaty of friendship with anybody, that's their sovereign prerogative. However, it is the deterioration in relationship and what has caused that deterioration that has led to this suspension of this, and consequently, trade issues, a ban on importation of Spanish goods into Algeria have now come into view. And what has led to this is what Algeria perceives as a softening of the position of Spain on the Western Sahara issue. Now, for this, I mean, we are dealing for the first time in 2 years with this Western Sahara issue. So I better give a bit of the background. So, both Morocco decided that Western Sahara, which is just south of Morocco, was part of Morocco, and that therefore it was part of Moroccan territory, and Morocco was going to exercise sovereign rights. The United Nations refused to recognize this claim by Morocco on Western Sahara, regarded Western Sahara as a colonial issue that should be given its independence. That was the position of the United Nations. And when I say the United Nations, I mean the majority of the member states of the United Nations. That was also the position of the then Organization of African Unity, that it was a colonial issue, colonial question, and that Morocco, and that led actually to Morocco walking out of the Organization of African Unity. So most of the, like in everything else, during the agitation to end colonial rule in Africa, instead of having one anti-colonial organization, they were split into different groups, probably again engineered. We allow, at times, the fault is in us, not in our stars, We allow ourselves, our hunger for power, we allow it to be used by even our enemies against us. So there was fragmentation of nationalist organizations in Western Sahara, and Algeria, that had a history of militant anti-colonial struggle, gave these nationalist organizations support. It became an armed struggle, and obviously Algeria was not only funding, but also giving weapons in Western Sahara. And the issue dragged on and on and on. Other nations moved on. The United Nations kept trying to arrange a decolonization process there where Morocco will agree. But to the Moroccans, it has now become a major issue. No government of Morocco will admit that it will give up Western Sahara. It won't last. There will be riots on the streets of Morocco. I remember once being sent by President Babangida on a trip to Morocco to meet the king of Morocco. I think it was King Mohammed V. And I had to tiptoe my way gingerly on this issue because, number one, we had recognized what we then called the Sahrawi Democratic Republic. We had recognized it. Morocco was not happy with that, decision, but Morocco, had this relationship with, it's not even a relationship, its attitude towards Nigeria, which I think was based more on culture and religion, that it did not want to have total break with Nigeria. Why did I say that it was partly culture, it was partly religion? When I was coming back, I was given a copy of the Quran to give to my president. But there was a history behind it. Was not just an ordinary copy. There was a history behind this particular copy of the Quran that was supposed to give to our president. So the Moroccans were prepared to overlook our recognition of the Sahrawi Democratic Republic, but it poisoned the relationship between Algeria and Morocco. And Algeria was prepared to define its relationship with any country based on that country's policy towards Western Sahara. Trump, during his presidency, polluted the waters by reversing American policy and now recognizing Moroccan claim to the Western Sahara. Biden has not reversed that decision. So it was because Algeria saw Spain as now tilting towards Morocco on the issue of Western Sahara that is behind this hostility now between Algeria and Morocco. It's not going to be an easy issue to resolve because the reason behind Spain tilting towards Morocco is because Morocco is holding Spain by the jugular. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the map of Africa and the map of Europe, you could, in fact, from the tip of Morocco, you could actually probably read a newspaper in southern Spain. So you could see how if Morocco decides to turn on the tap of immigrants, illegal immigrants, there will be a massive flow of immigrants, African immigrants, well, not only African, even Afghans come through there, Pakistanis come through there. The kind of thing that had been happening after Gaddafi was killed in Libya, it will even be worse in Morocco. And that is why Spain feels ill at ease in offending Morocco. So that is really, I'm sorry, this has taken too long, but they all have backgrounds to it.
Thank you, sir. Let me, in the maybe 7 minutes that we've got left, sir, let me throw this question to you regarding Angela Merkel. She was interviewed this week by a journalist, and some have said she ought to take responsibility for the war in Ukraine today because she blocked Ukraine's ascension into NATO while she was chancellor. What do you think that legacy should be for Angela Merkel when it comes to how she dealt with Russia, how she dealt with Ukraine, and how she dealt with NATO?
It's always a mistake to deal with historical issues with hindsight, because hindsight is always 2020. You see things perfectly. Whereas at the time when you have to deal with the issue, you probably don't see things clearly as you would now. And that probably explains why biographies are usually an exercise in justification rather than an exercise in admission of guilt. And the refusal of Angela Merkel to admit fault is precisely because the way she saw things at that time, no one could have predicted that there would be a Russian-Ukrainian war several years down the road. I'm not even sure that there is any head of government of NATO members at that time who thought denying Ukrainian membership in NATO will eventually lead to war. I mean, after all, they admitted the others and there were no problems. If I recall, there were cogent reasons why Ukraine was denied membership. Ukraine at that time was being controlled by oligarchs, criminals who had looted the state riches and who were still in control of the Commonwealth of Ukraine. Criminal gangs and what have you. Precisely, the same kind of situation under Boris Yeltsin, which was what led to what's the name of the president now in Russia?
Putin.
Putin was actually brought in by the KGB, who gently eased out Boris Yeltsin because he had lost control of Russia, and brought in a strong man who decided that this democracy was going to ruin Russia. Russia needed a hard, focused leader. And he sorted out Russia at that time. None of this nonsense with NGOs who were collecting money from the United States and Western countries and, deciding on, their demand for all kinds of ballot system and what have you. He rescued Russia. Let's give Putin his due on that. But Ukraine was under a similar system. In fact, most of the countries that left the Soviet bloc and became independent countries were under the control of oligarchs and criminal groups. So the NATO members felt that Ukraine was simply so disorganized. They had given them, bullet points that they must fulfill before they will qualify for membership. So Angela Merkel just did not oppose their membership out of malice. And Germany had the strongest economy, in Europe. And generally, she was more concerned about any move that will weaken the economy of Europe and force Western Germany to start bailing out countries that may go bankrupt. So, but I can see the debate going on, and from now until eternity, when it comes to looking at the history of strong leaders, was what you did 20 years ago, what you should have done. But then that's why history books are written, and that's why the study of history is interesting and illustrative and educative for all of us scholars.
So there was one thing she said in the interview, and I want to see if you agree with her view. Her words were this: diplomacy isn't wrong just because it hasn't worked. All over the world, whether you come to Africa or Asia, or even parts of Europe, we continue to see a form of uprising or another. We still have issues going on in Taiwan, Myanmar, all over, issues going on. And some have said that this is potentially the breakdown of democracy, of diplomacy. How do you manage effectively, sir, in a world where diplomacy doesn't appear to be working as we would have expected it to work?
Diplomacy is not wrong just because it hasn't worked. That's a profound statement by her. That's probably not what she meant to say. I could deconstruct what she meant, what she means to say. Actually, diplomacy has worked because the last World War that we had was going to an end in what, 1945? Between the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, how many years did we have? And yet, it's over 60 years, isn't it? Since the end of the Second World War, 70 years actually. And we haven't had a world war. To me, I take that as success for diplomacy. Two, we've had massive decolonization, whether in Africa or in Asia. I would take that as success of diplomacy, because actually, when you hear what Britain had to say, Winston Churchill saying, I didn't become the king's first minister to deny him of his empire. And Truman said, America did not go to war for you to keep your empire. We committed ourselves in the Atlantic Charter, to self-determination. So I take that as plus. When you look at the when you look at the progress that the world has made in social, economic targets, we've done considerably well. We haven't achieved the targets. I mean, history will come to an end. I never subscribed to end of history when the book was written. So we will continue to even shift the goalpost. If today the target is to move from 30 years to 45 years lifespan, if we get to 45, we will push it to 60. Then when we get to 60, we will push it forward. And each lamp post marks progress. And look at the United Nations Charter, the one where it deals with economic, social welfare issues, where the lifespan was, the level of poverty, where it was in 1945, and where we are now. It is diplomacy that has gradually got exploitative countries off the backs of developing countries. It's not fully off the back, not fully. And it probably will, even America today has been accused of exploiting Latin America after how many, over 100 years of independence of South American states. So to me, diplomacy works. Diplomacy breaks down when war starts. And you must make provision for war, because you may have to deal with someone coming to power who decides he doesn't believe in the system, who decides he wants to destroy the system for his own national goals. Then you go to war. Yes, okay, I will admit that at that point, diplomacy has broken down. But be careful. If you are going to define in a negative way failure of diplomacy because war has started, or else you will then be talking of, what was it they accused Neville Chamberlain of? Appeasement. Just not to have war, just to claim diplomacy is working. You continue to appease dictators. Then you may be going back to policies, to appeasing governments who may now be pursuing Holocaust, slavery, and all those things that we saw during the Second World War, which we pray that we never see again.
Thank you very much for this evening, sir. We have gone over time by 7 minutes, but I am going to take us 1 minute more over time. And I'm going to use that 1 minute. I wish the camera in the studio here was rightly positioned for me to celebrate you 100 edition of the program. That is worth celebrating, sir. 100 hours of the foreign policy genius of our generation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for all the sessions.
I thought you were sending a bottle of champagne. Ha!
I did. It was going through Russia and Ukraine, and they've blocked the grain.
Oh, I see. Blame everything on Russia and Ukraine. Okay. Thank you very much for that compliment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to our viewers, thank you for being there. Thank you for staying with us. And on that note, we end the program tonight. We will be back next week as we continue on all the different international issues around the world. Good night, sir. And good night to our viewers. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.